Hey folks, George here. I've got a new series of discussions here that we're going to share, and these will be more introductory discussions regarding the field of philosophy, right? So you might consider this an introduction to philosophy. We're going to cover the wide gamut of philosophical questions. There might be more questions than you might expect. There might be less questions than you might expect, but one thing that I hope we discover in these discussions is how interesting philosophy is and how interesting it is to ask philosophical questions about our own beliefs and our own way of seeing the world, and of course questions about the world around us, right? That's rather vague, but yeah, philosophy, we'll see how philosophy tries to focus some of these questions as this series goes on. Yeah. So the first question that I hope you'll ask, and I hope this question, very philosophical question, that we ask regarding any sort of subject that we start to engage with is, what is philosophy? What is this thing called philosophy? Well, that's rather unfortunate that you're asking a philosopher about this, because I think if you ask 10 different philosophers, you'll probably get 20 different answers. So it's a hard question to answer, but as you'll see, many philosophical questions are rather difficult to really give a very firm, definitive, solid answer to. What does that reveal? Well, for me, what that reveals is that one key aspect of that question, what is philosophy? One key aspect of that is that philosophy is asking the questions. Asking questions, right? That's what I mean by philosophy. Asking questions about our fundamental assumptions. Asking questions about the fundamental nature of things. Yeah, yes. So in philosophy, what is philosophy is a very philosophical question. Or somebody might ask in the field of, let's say, music, what is music? And I think once you really dive deep and start engaging with even that question, we assume that we understand what music is. But I think if you ask a musician who really engages with music, and if you start really engaging with music, you'll discover that that question is probably a lot more complicated than you might originally think, right? And so that's, I think, the value of philosophy, is that we ask a lot of these difficult questions that maybe didn't occur to you at first, right? Or another way to think about this is that actually these questions do occur to you, but for whatever reason we don't ask them, right? We've been trained in our society and our culture to veer away from certain kinds of questions, right? Which is odd to me, because as children, or I'll speak for myself at least, forgive me, but as a child, I remember asking all sorts of odd questions. I always asked, why is the sky blue? Where you just keep asking this question, why? And you go into very interesting directions. But do you remember that as children, we all kept on asking, why? 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 So why is the sky blue? Well, the sky is blue, I think, because of the water vapor in the air and the light reflecting off the water vapor in the air. Oh, why is there water vapor in the air? Oh, I guess because, yeah, the heat from the sun sort of evaporates to a certain degree, certain parts of the oceans. I think that's how it works. Oh, really? Why does the sun do that? Oh, because water has a certain energy level to stay liquid, and the heat gives it enough. The heat of the sun gives the water enough energy to evaporate into water vapor, and thus put in the air. Why? Why does the sun have so much energy? I think it's because some kinds of nuclear reactions that are happening at the core of the sun, where hydrogen fuses into all sorts of different atoms, thus giving off all sorts of excess energy. Oh, really? Why does that happen? Oh, boy. Right? And then as we ask these questions, why, I'm thinking, my goodness, why indeed? And we see how interesting and how complicated some of these questions can be, right? And you'll forgive me, but I like having that childlike wonder about the world around me and even about myself. So what is philosophy then? Well, I'm not sure that I've answered that question totally perfectly just yet. However, at least part of what philosophy is a field that gives us the space to ask those kinds of questions, right? These fundamental questions. And that's what I think at least part of the answer to what is philosophy. I'll back up for a quick second here. One book that I'm going to be using to guide through these discussions is John Chafee's book, The Philosopher's Way. And this is a nice textbook as an introduction to philosophy. And one thing that he does in this textbook that I really like is he just gives us a lot of little blurbs or a lot of little quotes by very famous philosophers trying to answer those questions. What is philosophy? How do we define philosophy? So I think I'm going to read some of those quotes right now and see exactly how we might answer this question. He gives us Cicero, who says, rightly defined, philosophy is simply the love of wisdom. He gives us another philosopher, Solomon ibn Gabirol. Your wisdom gave rise to an endless desire. He shares with us the ancient Chinese philosopher Confucius, who says, he who knows he is a fool is not a great fool. And so that's an interesting take on philosophy, right? Confucius says that we have to know. Philosophy helps us understand what little we do know about the world and even about ourselves. The ancient philosopher Epicurus says, let no young man delay the study of philosophy, and let no old man become weary of it, for it is never too early nor too late to care for the well-being of the soul. Walter Kaufmann, the 20th century thinker, asks, or rather says, philosophy means liberation from the two dimensions of routine, soaring above the well-known, seeing it in new perspectives, arousing wonder and the wish to fly. The ancient Greek philosopher Plato says, the feeling of wonder is the touchstone of the philosopher, and all philosophy has its origins in wonder. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle says, for it is owning to their wonder that people both now begin and at first began to philosophize. The Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein from the 20th century says, philosophy is not a theory, but an activity. John Chafee, like myself, loves Wittgenstein, so he gives Wittgenstein two blurbs here. Wittgenstein also says, philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. Isn't that going to be an interesting avenue for philosophers to engage in? How does our language bewitch how we see the world and how we think and how we understand? The Jewish philosopher Baruch Spinoza says, I do not know how to teach philosophy without becoming a disturber of the peace. Ancient Roman philosopher Epictetus says, the beginning of philosophy is the recognition of the conflict between opinions. Indeed, in these discussions, we're going to see that there's a lot of conflicting opinions about what is or what isn't reasonable to think. Henri Frédéric Amiel says, philosophy means the complete liberty of the mind and therefore independence of all social, political, or religious prejudice. Indeed, that is what we're going to examine throughout this series is how do our own biases, our own perspectives skew how we see the world, right? And how can we get out of our prejudices, out of our biases? The British philosopher from the 20th century, Alfred North Whitehead, philosophy asks the simple question, what is it all about? The 20th and 21st century philosopher Martha Nussbaum says, we should insist that philosophy may, indeed should, be responsive to human experience and yet critical of the defective thinking it sometimes contains. Indeed, that's how I see philosophy too, that we are trying to fix our defective ways of thinking. I've got a lot of such defective ways of thinking that I will reveal throughout these discussions. Denis Diderot suggests the first step toward philosophy is doubt. Indeed, we're going to see that doubt plays a huge role in how we start to philosophize. By doubting one thing, how might we respond to such doubts? Because we do have to respond, don't we? After all, I've got to get out of bed in the morning. Now we'll move on to a little bit more about philosophy and how we think in a philosophical manner, certainly from the Western perspective, right? And that is through well-reasoned, structured arguments and argumentation. What does that mean, argumentation? A well-reasoned argumentation, what is that? What it really means is giving a reason, giving another reason, and so on, until you make a conclusion, right? Do your reasons support a conclusion? And that's really how philosophical argument works, by giving reasons in order to support some conclusion or some belief that I have, right? Valid arguments are arguments whereby the reasons logically lead to the conclusion, right? Sound arguments are both valid and true. The reasons are true. So the arguments that we're really looking for are both valid and sound arguments, which are valid, well-structured arguments and true arguments. Let me give a nice example to help really illustrate the points of validity and soundness. Well, somebody might say, I might give an argument. Here's the first reason I believe. All people with blue shirts are brilliant. First reason. Second reason, George is wearing a blue shirt. My conclusion, therefore George is brilliant, right? Now I've played a little trick right there, right? However, logically, if you believe that people with blue shirts are brilliant and you believe that George is wearing a blue shirt, then you have to believe George is brilliant, right? However, is that a sound argument? Are these reasons true? Well, I actually don't think it's a sound argument. I don't think that it's true, for example, that all people wearing blue shirts are brilliant, right? And that's how we could see a nice example of a valid argument, but it's not sound, and therefore it's not a good, strong philosophical argument, right? Now, there are other reasons, and there's other arguments that I believe I can give to prove why George is brilliant. I just gave a bad argument, right? And I think that's going to be a key thing here, is we want to believe good conclusions for the right reasons, for sound reasons, for using sound arguments, right? It's not good enough to arrive at the right belief. You have to have the right reasons to go along with that belief or that conclusion. Why is that so important? Why it's important is because something might happen in your life that makes you question some of those reasons or question some of your beliefs. And if you know the proper way of believing certain things through valid and sound arguments, then you will lead to and have stronger beliefs. Now, one question that I think is very interesting lately is racism, right? Now, I believe racism is bad. I hope you do too, right? That racism is bad. But what are our reasons for believing racism is bad? And I'm very bothered by meeting and talking with a lot of people when they cannot share with me sound, valid arguments about that leads to the idea that racism is bad. Because if you don't have sound arguments to support that belief, racism is bad, then it's going to be easy for people to fool you in the future regarding racist or other sorts of poorly reasoned beliefs. And that's why in philosophy, one of the key goals that I'm going to put forward is how to create and how to foster and how to nurture well-reasoned beliefs, right? And that's going to be very important here. Really quick, I'll run through some reasons why some folks might suggest that some arguments are fallacious. Very frequently, especially racist sort of arguments that lead to racist conclusions, very frequently there's fallacious reasoning that is generated using hasty generalizations or overgeneralizations or false generalizations of some type or another. Very frequently they'll go something like, all this are bad, right? Well, when we say all this are something, isn't that an easy way to overgeneralize? And very frequently we will see that those are false generalizations, right? Another argument, just like my fallacious reasoning earlier, all people with blue shirts are brilliant. Another sort of fallacious reasoning is causal fallacies. That is, when we don't properly identify the cause. Another way that my previous argument about wearing blue shirts and therefore being brilliant, doesn't that misidentify the cause? It's not the blue shirt, after all, that makes George brilliant. It's probably some other thing, or maybe nothing at all. But it certainly isn't the blue shirt that makes George brilliant, if anything does. Because and ultimately that's misidentifying the cause. So we don't want to make those sorts of fallacious arguments either. And the last type of fallacious reasoning that I want to give is relevance fallacies. And those are, fallacies that when we appeal too much to emotions, for example, or we appeal to authority or tradition, right? Now you might think, oh, well, yeah, my emotions are that I am brilliant, right? I've got a very strong emotion connected to my own brilliance. Well, is that a good reason to believe in my own brilliance? Probably not, because I'm too in love with myself, let's say, right? And my emotions might distract me and lead to more fallacious reasoning in that manner. Now, what does all of this show? What I think this shows is that philosophy, at least partly, is about thinking clearly about difficult questions. How do we think clearly and how do we think reasonably about so many interesting questions that we might encounter? Now, with all that in mind, what we will see is that there's many different branches, if you will, of philosophy. And there's so many that I won't be able to go over all of them, even in these discussions, right? I won't examine all of these different focal points in philosophical thinking. But I think as a broad generalization, there's a generalization again, right? We will talk about generalizations throughout these discussions. But as a broad generalization, some of these nice demarcations of philosophy are metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, political philosophy, and aesthetics. There's a lot more also, but that's a nice roundabout way of talking about these things for now. What is metaphysics? Let's go one by one now. What is metaphysics? Metaphysics basically asks the questions, again, this is going to be an overgeneral. Let's go one by one through these. So what is metaphysics? Now, again, this is going to be a broad generalization, but fundamentally, metaphysics asks very frequently the question, what is real? What is real? What exists? Or what doesn't exist, right? What is the nature of reality? Or what is the nature of things, right? What is the nature of George? What is the reality of George? What is George really? We're going to examine that question in a little while. Epistemology is another branch of philosophy that mostly focuses on the questions of knowledge. What is knowledge? How do we know anything? What is truth? And what is a reasonable thing to believe? What is it reasonable to believe about myself? What is it reasonable to believe about other things? What is reasonableness? What is rational thinking? Another branch of philosophy is ethics. What is a good life? Or what isn't a good life? What is the right thing to do at any time or moment? What are the right principles to live by? Right? How shall we treat people? Those are all ethical questions. Very related, at least as far as I can tell, is political philosophy. Political philosophy is going to ask questions, what is justice? or what is not justice? What is a good government, or what is a bad government? Right? What should governments do? What shouldn't governments do? Those are political philosophy questions. And I'll wrap this up with the branches of philosophy with aesthetics. Aesthetics is what is beauty, or what is art, or what is good art, what isn't good art. Now, some of us might be saying, oh, that's a question that you can't answer, right? It's all very subjective. Fine, but do you realize you've answered that question then? And when you answer that question, oh, all art is subjective, what does that really mean? And there's a lot of philosophers who go deep into that question. What does it mean when I say, I like this song? Or what does it mean when I say, this is a good piece of music and this is a bad piece of music? What does that really mean? Is there a such thing as good music or bad music? Now, this is, at a hunch, we might say, no, it's all subjective. But again, so what does that mean then when I say this is good music and this is bad music? By the way, I do have tastes. What do those tastes really mean? What does it mean when I express my tastes? I think those are very fascinating questions, by the way, right? And that's why I like philosophy, because it asks so many fascinating questions where the answer might not be as obvious as you think. And that all takes us to Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell is a British philosopher from the early 1900s. And he wrote this book called The Problems of Philosophy, where he discusses the value of philosophy. And I love this essay because it really helps us engage with, or at least this excerpt of this essay, it helps us engage with what is this thing called philosophy? What are we going to be doing in these discussions? Well, one question is that he asks, isn't philosophy just hair splitting? Is it merely hair splitting? Especially since so many of these questions are impossible to answer. What is a good life? The ethical question, right? What is a good life? Is it possible to answer that question? Bertrand Russell acknowledges that it's nearly impossible to answer that question, right? And someone else might question, is it even practical philosophy? Well, a philosopher is going to say, what does it mean to be practical? Right? What do you mean by practical? And then somebody might respond and say, well, it's obviously practical. Food is practical. Money is practical, right? It's practical to feed my body. Bertrand Russell responds and says, isn't it practical then to also feed the mind? And by the way, why is money so practical to us? And just by asking that question, we're doing philosophy. Just by you responding to that question and thinking about the question, why is a practical life so important? And why are practical issues so important and practical matters? That is philosophy. Us thinking about those questions is philosophy. So Bertrand Russell points out that philosophy is about examining our assumptions and thinking about our assumptions and our convictions and our prejudices and our biases and our ways of seeing the world and our fundamental beliefs. That is what philosophy is, thinking about our beliefs and how we think about those beliefs. He acknowledges, Bertrand Russell does, that science and other fields like mathematics give us very hard and firm answers. Fair enough. Science gives us answers. What will happen to this book if I let it go? Yeah, anybody who knows basics of Newtonian mechanics understands what will happen to the book, that it will fall, right? Actually, I don't even think that you need to understand Newtonian mechanics to know that the book will fall, right? But Bertrand Russell is going to say, yes, indeed, science does give us good and hard answers. Science gives us the interactions we're having right now, the camera that I'm filming this with, the internet that I've posted this on. So many good practical answers science and other fields give us. However, Bertrand Russell acknowledges that philosophy very rarely gives us any definitive answers about the philosophical questions. However, aren't those philosophical questions the most important to us? What's my purpose in life? I don't know what the answer to that is. I don't think that it's easy to find the answer to that question. I don't think you'll find it in any physics textbook or biology textbook. or a philosophy textbook for that matter. But isn't it important that we ask that question and engage with that question? How shall I live my life? It's hard to come up with a definitive answer to that question. But isn't that why it's such an important question? What is the nature of love? Philosophy of love that I'll talk a little bit about as we progress here. What is love? Yeah, I've watched romantic movies. I've seen that they give nice, pithy answers to these things. Like, is it so simple? Is it so simple? And shouldn't we think about these questions a great deal? And doesn't the fact that we do ask these questions and think about these questions show how important these questions are? Well, to Bertrand Russell, to me, and I hope these questions are important to you too. Right? We must keep asking these questions because they're so important. Why ask the questions, though, if they don't give answers? Well, here's one reason. Because in asking the questions and in thinking about the questions, don't so many other possibilities occur to us that we might not have considered before? I know that when I was a kid, my dad had said, George, you should get into business. Business is where they make all the money. Sure enough, and I had thought that was a nice thing. But then I thought about it, and I'll confess to you, as a kid, I didn't even know there was a such thing as philosophy. And that when I finally did engage with philosophy, I saw a whole world open ahead of me. And I saw, wow, there's so many other opportunities. There's so many other paths. There's so many other ways to see the world and so many other ways to think about the world. And how can you ever discover those different ways of seeing and thinking about the world if you don't sit down and think about them and engage with these sorts of philosophical questions? And that is the key value for Bertrand Russell, at least, and for me too, about philosophy. It helps us contemplate the world, life, everything around us, our place in the world. And it frees us from the prison of our previous assumptions about the world. And that's what I hope to engage with here in these discussions as we go on. See you next time. Bye-bye.